Hello, everybody. This is Paul Herman, the Prince of Motivation and host of Zaka Presents My Journey. We're creating this vulnerable and positive platform where you get inspired and motivated from different leaders from our community. Today, our guest is Kofi Amoo Gottfried, who's Vice President of DoorDash. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, man. I know that our viewers and listeners are listening to obviously hear a lot about what you got going on over there. But before we kind of jump into what you got going on at DoorDash, I want to kind of just talk a little bit more about your background and where you're from. Obviously, it's an honor to have, executives like yourself on the show. So if you could give us a little background of where you're from and kind of like your upbringing.
Yeah, I'm a son of Africa, a son of Ghana. So I was born and raised in Ghana. Lived there till I was 17, and then I left Ghana to move to the States to come to college here. And I always like to say I moved from Ghana to St. Paul, Minnesota. And if you look up culture shock in the dictionary, like that's basically the move. Ghana to Minnesota, everything changes.
I can only imagine that transition.
So that's what brought me here. And then went to college and since then have been working in the worlds of sort of advertising and marketing in various roles at different companies, bringing me to DoorDash.
Okay. Now, could you tell me about that transition? Like, what was one of the hardest transitions, coming from Ghana, and the culture of Ghana to then being in Minnesota?
Oh, man. I think it was a couple of things. I think that the thing that was the rudest shock was definitely the weather. If you live in 85 degree weather all year round, like minus 40 is a whole different sort of era that your brain doesn't even understand. So I think that was definitely one of the things. I think I was very lucky in the sense that I went to a college that was very unusual. So I went to this college called McAllister College, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mm-hmm. But it was very diverse, right? So like the focus of that college was sort of internationalism, diversity, multiculturalism. So I had this very weird bubble where like I got here from Ghana, and then my freshman class of 400 kids, like 120 of us were like fresh off the boat, right? From like 80 different countries. So it wasn't like a real world experience at all. So at McAllister, I was like, this feels like, a very international place, but then you would leave the campus.
Yeah, that's when it would change.
And then you're like, oh no, this is actually not a very international place at all. Like I'm in the Midwest, and St. Paul was like wonderful to me. But I think, the weather, the sort of the culture felt very different to me. I'll use an example even from a learning perspective. So I had come from Ghana, which like lived by the British system, which essentially was like an exam at the end of every year, and really an exam after 5 years that you really cared about. And then I came into a U.S. educational system that was about continuous assessment and pop quizzes and class participation and sort of all of these things that I knew nothing about. And, halfway through my freshman year, like, the dean of international students had to have a chat with me, and they're like, yo, you need to maintain a 3.0 to keep your scholarship. You're like at a 3.1 right now. So just like
tapping you on the shoulder. Okay.
Just know. And it was because I didn't know actually how to like be successful in this environment yet. I didn't know that I was required to speak up in class. I didn't know that these pop quizzes actually mattered. So there was just like a bunch of these things that I had to get like adjusted to.
Okay. Now, obviously, that is definitely a major culture shock. Like, obviously, coming from a background where it's not expected of you, but then all of a sudden it is expected of you. And if there's no one to kind of help you transition into there, like having like a mentor or someone who's come before you to kind of tell you like, hey, look, just to let you know, there's a little bit of a change right here. You're going to have to do this. You kind of had to find out things on your own. Could you explain a little bit more about like growing up in Ghana? Like, how did that impact your career trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrific question. I think a couple of things. So, growing up in Ghana, had like, I think I got to college and I was probably much more mature than many of my classmates because, I just seen like more of life, in Ghana, people send their kids away to boarding school. This is like what everyone in the country does. Boarding school in Ghana in those days was like going to a juvie, man. It was no joke, you know. So like by the time I got to college, like I'd seen and done a lot, and I think was in some ways more prepared to be independent, in some ways more prepared to like navigate the world, navigate different types of people. I'll say that like having that background just gave me like enormous amounts of like resilience and enormous amounts of like gratitude, you know, like on a lot of levels. There's days when like I look at like where I am and I like kind of have to pinch myself. I'm like, who would have thought that like, you know, this kid from Ghana would be the VP of marketing at DoorDash or at Facebook. And but that gratitude for me gives me like and that background and where I came from gives me an enormous amount of confidence, because I generally feel like I'm playing with house money. I'm like, you know what? In 1997, I had $100 in a suitcase. Like
Yeah, you definitely live in a dream. You definitely. Do you feel like your parents have, you know, and your culture has impacted your lifestyle and the way you think and the way you move? Obviously, coming from Ghana, like you said, you never even thought that this would even be possible. But look where you're sitting right now, and the impact that you have now. So, do you feel like your parents and the culture has kind of like inspired you to move like this?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. You know, I think one of the things that we don't maybe talk about enough, and this could be an area we go into, is like there's an unstated privilege that we don't discuss to being like a foreign-born Black person in America, right? Which is that like I grew up in a country where everyone was Black.
True.
Like the president was Black, you know, every doctor was Black, every scientist was Black, every lawyer was Black. So that expectation of like, you know, coming from a family, you know, my parents were educated. They expected us to be educated. They expected us to go to college. You know, I was fortunate enough to be able to get a scholarship to go do that at Macalester, because that's the only way I could have afforded to do that. But I think like that, not having that like ceiling where you know, we always talk about like in the States, like you can't be what you can't see. I could see it. I had seen it. You know, obviously it's very different once you get here. Because then you're like, no, I can't see it anymore. You know what I mean? Like now I actually don't see it. But I do think like that background, that sort of drive that came from my parents, that sort of feeling that as someone who was fortunate, that I had to do everything I could to take advantage of the opportunity that had been presented to me. I think all of those were like massive things for me.
Now, you had a lot of, you know, background in corporate America, climbing that corporate ladder, and now you're the VP of marketing, like you said, at DoorDash. Like, this is massive, you know, coming from Ghana to being where you are right now. Like, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience at DoorDash and what do you actually do on a day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at DoorDash about 2.5 years. Before this, I was the VP of marketing at Facebook for a few years, and then spent some time in some other places. You know, but at DoorDash, like the marketing organization is accountable for a bunch of things, right? So we're on the hook for, you know, new customer acquisition. We're on the hook for, you know, getting our customers to come back and reorder. The thing that's like wonderful and complex about this business is that like this is a 3-sided marketplace, right? So I don't just have one customer. You know, I have consumers. So most people think about DoorDash and you think about it from a consumer perspective of like, oh, I order this food, but that's only one of the constituents that I think about. Like I have to think about businesses. So we're also a B2B business. There's 500,000 restaurants, small businesses, bodegas, groceries, pet shops on the platform that are counting on us to drive volume for them. So, you know, part of my team's job is like, how do we acquire those businesses onto DoorDash? How do we make sure that they're successful once they're on the platform? And then, of course, we've got the third side of the marketplace, which is drivers. So you've got our dashers, you know, and, you know, there's millions of dashers who turn to DoorDash. Millions of people come to DoorDash because they're looking for a part-time gig. Many of them are, you know, doing this, you know, less than 10 hours a week. It's a side hustle. It's a way for them to top up on their base income. But again, we then have to think about how do we acquire those people? How do we create opportunity for them to find this work? once they do come on DoorDash, how do we make sure it's a great experience and that they can continue to earn on the platform? And so like that day to day, these are the sort of types of questions that my team is thinking about. And then, you know, obviously investing dollars in terms of like hitting those goals.
Mm-hmm. Now, a man coming from, obviously being an immigrant, coming from Ghana, how is your team? Like, there's something that you just mentioned about the Dashers. Like, I know that was a way of bringing income to people within the community. Yep. Do you feel like some of those Dashers are immigrants? Like, what is the population you feel of that? Are those individuals are immigrants? How are they actually, you know, growing and developing financially from opportunities like that from DoorDash?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I think one of the things that got me excited about DoorDash, I should have said this up front, is that like this is an immigrant founded company. So our founder Tony Shu moved here from China when he was 5 to Springfield, Illinois. Worked in his mom's Chinese restaurant. Like these are people that share the same types of conversations that we're talking about, sort of growing up with this resilience, growing up having to fit in, growing up having to figure out your way in the world. And so when we think about our business, a lot of what we think about is like, how do we use this business? Like our mission is to empower local economies. How do we use this business to really provide opportunities? You know, how do we create access to opportunities for Dashers, and not just for Dashers, but for small business owners? Like you think about the restaurant in your neighborhood, you think about the bodega in your neighborhood. They're immigrants. Yeah. Right? Like who starts restaurant businesses? It's immigrants. Like who does Dash? And it's immigrants. So, you know, I don't have the stats off the top of my head to share, but I do know that that's a very large part of the community that we cater to. And it's actually been a big part of how we show up as a business and how we show up as a brand. You know, we built this initiative a couple of years ago called Kitchens Without Borders. And it was all about literally refugee and immigrant-owned restaurants on DoorDash and creating like a platform for them and giving them different benefits and different access to capital and resources to allow them to flourish. So this is definitely a part of how we think about ourselves and our role in the world.
That's very powerful. Very powerful. And to know that you have that ability to influence a community at a larger level, you know, having a platform like DoorDash and being able to walk into those meetings and actually say, hey, look, we need to look out for more immigrants. We need to look out for individuals, people of color. So this is where this question is going to come up. You know, you being in Silicon Valley, you know, you being in the corporate America, like how are you, like what are some of the obstacles that you face as an immigrant male in that environment?
Well, I mean, look, the most obvious one is that the number of rooms that I'm in where there are people that look like me is like -0, right? And so, and by the way, the higher up you go, the more likely this is to be true.
Yeah, yes.
You know, so the number, you know, if I have meetings with my peers at DoorDash, at Facebook, at let's call people at VP level at tech companies, it's going to be a handful of people that look like you. You know, never mind like where they're from. Like if you want people that look like you that are from Ghana, you can forget about that. but like people that look like you, period, you know, is a trip. And so I think one of the things that I think is really hard, and I think, you know, there's this concept of like imposter syndrome. And I think it's documented that like women and minorities feel it more. And I think that's one of the hardest things because, you know, going back to my thing about like, you can't be what you can't see. When you end up in like where I'm at and you're increasingly in rooms where no one looks like you, you start to wonder if you're meant to be there. And so that's a thing that that's a thing that you got to check yourself on. And certainly a thing that I have to check myself on and think about and sort of retain that confidence of like, no, I am meant to be, and I am doing the work, and my team is delivering. But it's not something that ever goes away. So it's sort of like a low grade, you know, thing that
it's hovering over there. It's hovering in the back.
It's hovering over there, you know. And then look, I think like particularly if you end up living in the Bay Area, which I did for a while, you then also have the challenge of like, that's not just true in your work, that's true in your life. Right. So like there's not a large Black community. Like you're not going to be around your people. You know, how do you build community and all those things? And not to say that like you can't build community with people that are Black, because obviously you can, and like I have friends from all over the world. But you know, I'll give you like a live example. There was a event maybe 3 years ago. I was on Facebook at the time, and so we went to this like big marketing shindig in downtown San Francisco, at like one of the hotels where I was actually one of the featured like speakers for this community of marketers in the Bay Area. So like one of those nights, it's like super dope. Everybody's dressed up, like amazing. And so after we go down to the bar, which is reserved for the same people from this conference to like have drinks and stuff. So I'm in the bar having a drink, hanging out with my team. And I'm wearing a tux, you guys. And somebody comes in and hands me their coat.
Oh, wow.
You know what I mean? Like that.
Wow.
That is like one of those things where you're like, wait, is this actually happening? So those types of like microaggressions when you're in a world that's not necessarily built for you, when you're not around people that like necessarily understand. When, by the way, these people in these like worlds don't necessarily see people like you. So of course, if they saw the one black dude in this like fancy bar, clearly I was the bellhop or like the coat guy or
mind you, you're not even at the door. You deep at the bar.
Nowhere near the door. Mind you, I was on stage like an hour earlier. You know,
and to the listeners, I hope you're hearing this. That means that this person had to walk through the whole place and go directly to you. You know what I'm saying? Like, hey, look, excuse me. I'm going to look for this man at the bar right there. Wow. I'm sorry you even had to even face something like that, you know, and obviously, how do you stay motivated after, you know, going through something like that? Like, obviously you were in front of your peers. It's a moment where you obviously might've felt humiliated at one point.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, how did you manage to bounce back and still have I'm assuming you had a productive night. I'm hoping you didn't leave.
I mean, no, I didn't leave because, you know, I'm not going to let anybody take my shine. You know what I mean?
Let's get it. Let's get it, Kofi.
Like, yeah, like, I mean, I actually said to this person, I was like, why would you think that, like, I was like, what made you think? Like, to your point, Paul, like, you walked across this whole room.
Yeah, you just did.
Like, why would you think and of course, then it was like, that
moment. Now it's hovering over their heads now.
But it was like really, I mean, it also like, I think was instructive even for my team.
Yes, to see that.
Because I had my leadership team with me. And it was instructive for them to see this happen and be like, oh shit, this is like this shit that people talk about. We're actually seeing it.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's sometimes
actually, it's not, and it's happening to our boss. You know what I mean? Like,
it's a disconnect.
So look, I mean, I think for me, I have, and I think all of us have to do this on some level, which is to like, you have to find a way to shake this stuff up. I mean, that's like one example, like, you know, and I could come up with 100 if we had enough time. You know, that's just the one that came up. And
so
you got to figure out a way to shake it out. For me, that's about like understanding like the context I'm in, like trying to demand more of the people around me when it happens. You know, in this particular case, it's like a random person at the bar. So like, I didn't want to get into it. I just gave them a quick little piece of my mind. They apologized.
Yeah. So then with that being said, you're hitting on something very important. Like, what are some of the qualities you think are necessary for a person of color, you know, in a leadership role like yourself? Like, obviously dealing with a situation like that, you could have went left or you could have went right. Like, what are some of those qualities that you feel like a leader, a man of color, a woman of color, a minority, you know, might need?
Yeah, I mean, like this is hard, right? But I think, like, and you know, I'm sure some of the other speakers have talked about this. In fact, when I listened to some of the episodes, this theme came up. But like, for me, I think one of the qualities is the realization that like you're always you have to always be on point. Right. And that there's not a great degree of margin for error. So like for me in these situations, it's more like, okay, like let me just like reflect before I respond. Let me take a beat. You know, like it's not gonna take much for me to be seen as the angry black guy.
Yeah.
It's really not gonna take much, you know what I mean?
And that's some of the reaction that someone might have assumed that would happen.
That's right.
You know, but you, like you said, like you got to be able to fall back analyze the situation, know that you don't even just represent yourself, you represent your culture. You represent the
Correct.
people that come before you and also after you.
And the people and more importantly, the people that will come after.
Yeah, 100%.
The people that, you know, you end up opening doors for, right? Because the reality is that, like, at the end of the day, more than anything, that almost is my job. So like I've described like what I do at DoorDash, but ultimately what I also have to do at DoorDash is to build a team that's diverse. It's to like build a team that is, you know, that has Black and brown people in leadership. It's to build a team that like is able to bring like different perspectives into the business. And that's something that like I hold myself and my entire team accountable for, right? Because like if I'm here and that's not happening, like I kind of have failed regardless of if we're hitting the goals, at least in my judgment of myself.
No, well said and well taken. And I feel like that brings me to that next question of just mentorship. Like you just said, you know, being a leader, I know obviously that is a major role that comes with being a leader, you know,
Yep.
mentorship. I know you have this thing that you got going on, Monday night mentorship. Like, could you express to me a little bit more about what that is and, you know, who are the people that you're impacting?
Yeah, I mean, Monday night mentorship has been amazing. It was started probably 18 months ago by my friends Jabari Hearn, who's the SVP of marketing at Westbrook, Will Smith's company, and Julian Duncan, who's the CMO at the Houston Texans. I mean, we had known each other for years, and I think this was like early on in the pandemic. Jabari was at Lyft at the time, had to lay off his team, and he was like dealing with this in like a, you know, and like, whoa, like this is like a big moment. People are losing their jobs. Black and brown people are losing their jobs disproportionately. How do we come together as a community of experienced senior marketing and business leaders who can then provide like counsel to sort of the next generation that's like navigating this very turbulent moment? And so Monday Night Membership was born out of that. And it just started, you know, Jabari and Julian like putting out a call on LinkedIn, hitting up a bunch of us. So myself, Jason White, who's the CMO at MTV, Daniel Cherry, who's a VP at where did DC go these days? He was at Activision, but he's moved on. Melissa Waters, who's the VP of marketing at Instagram. You know, so a bunch of us basically came together, and it's incredible. It's a group of, you know, about 12 to 15 mentors, and we just made ourselves available every Monday to answer people's questions about work, life, navigating corporate, and it's turned into a thing where, you know, every Monday, like north of 100 people just turn up, and like we've now built more programming around it and made it sort of more robust. And you know, working with Devika, you know, and her business, and you know, her leaning in. So we've got like a really good crew, and we've been, you know, we were just chatting yesterday actually, and you know, we're now up to like, you know, hundreds of people that are part of this community on LinkedIn and tuning in every week. And not just learning from us, but like also teaching us and learning from each other.
Yeah.
And so
you can learn something from everybody.
Exactly. And so it's been a really dope thing to be part of.
Well, congratulations. I mean, about all of that. I feel like, you know, your story, the words that you've shared with us on the show today has been very empowering. I know that you mentioned something that was very important in the beginning, like who would have ever thought, you know, coming from Ghana to be where you are right now. And I think that's something that the listeners, if you're listening right now, that's something you should definitely pull away from. Like anything is possible if you just put your mind to it. And more importantly, like you said, your reaction and how you operate in different situations and circumstances, but you definitely have pushed through to kind of achieve greatness. My last thing to you is just like any last words for our Zaka community right now. I know that your time is very limited. So any last words you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, thank you for having me. It's been terrific to be part of this. I will say, just to buttress on what you just said, like, I think you're right that like you can put your mind, you know, if you put your mind to, you can achieve it. But I think it's important to like think of that in the context of, you know, where we live and where we are, right? Which is that sometimes there are things in your way that you can't get around by yourself, right? And so I think this is why communities like Zaka are really important. I think one of the things that's been so important for me, and I'll encourage everyone to do, is like build a community of people that have your back, right? Like it's easy for me to sit up here and talk about, you know, I did this and I did that, and then I took that job and I did that thing. But the reality is that like that's all been built off of like great mentors, great bosses, great leaders, people that have been able to tap when I have a challenge, that like reach out and provide advice or perspective or a connection or an introduction. And so that's what I'll leave you with, which is like, you know, build that community that's going to have you, and do that with every opportunity. And in any job that you're in, it doesn't matter what the job is or what the role is, there's actually an opportunity to build that community. Because you actually never know where people are going to end up. You know, when I look back at my first job and sort of where all of those people have ended up and the things that they're doing, like all of those relationships are still important and they all still continue to sustain me, even though like I didn't know at the time that like someone I met at my first job would then hire me, you know, 10 years down the line to go open an agency in Ghana. But because it built that community and built that relationship in sort of an authentic way versus in a like, hey, let's do networking or whatever it is, like, you know, those things always come back to pay off.
Well, it is very important to build strong relationships, and obviously make sure that when you reach a platform like yourself, that you use it for greatness, like what you're doing right now at DoorDash. Again, Kofi, congratulations on all your success. You know, just again, coming from Ghana to where you are right now, school and education, your community, your culture, the people you're influencing every single day. If you want to hear more stories like Kofi, check us out at ZakaConnect.com or follow our feed Zaka wherever you listen to your podcast. Again, Kofi, thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Glad to be here, man.